That morning in 1851, the richest man in New Orleans gambled half his fortune to buy a single woman. The crowd thought he was obsessed with her beauty, but the truth was far more terrifying. He didn't buy her to be his slave. He bought her to be his prisoner, because if this woman spoke just one word of the truth, the entire city would legally belong to her. She wasn't the world's most beautiful slave. She was the world's most powerful heiress, buried alive by a conspiracy of kings. The ocean has a way of swallowing secrets, but some secrets are too heavy to sink. In the autumn of 1837, a ship called the Star of the South cut through the thick mist of the Gulf of Mexico, heading toward the mouth of the Mississippi. To any onlooker, it was just another vessel carrying cargo. But deep within the mahogany-lined cabins sat a woman who did not belong in this world of chains and shadows. Her name was Eleanor Reynolds. She sat by the porthole, the gold of her silk dress shimmering in the dim lantern light. She was 22 years old, educated in the finest schools of Havana, fluent in 3 languages, and possessing a beauty that felt haunting. It wasn't just the symmetry of her face or the depth of her amber eyes. It was the way she carried herself, like a woman who had never known a master. In her lap sat a small, locked mahogany box. Inside that box were her letters of manumission, the legal documents proving she was a free citizen. Beside her sat her protector, a grey-haired Spanish gentleman who had promised her, Father, he would see her safely to her new life in Louisiana. Eleanor looked out at the dark water and felt a chill. She didn't know that she wasn't just sailing toward a new city. She was sailing into a trap that had been set months before she even stepped onto that ship. When the Star of the South finally docked at the New Orleans wharf, the air was thick, not just with the smell of jasmine and salt water, but with the stench of the slave markets just a few blocks away. As the gangplank lowered, Eleanor's protector suddenly gripped his chest. He gasped, his face turning a sickly shade of grey. Before Eleanor could call for help, he collapsed onto the wooden deck. In the chaos that followed, Eleanor was surrounded, not by doctors, but by men in tall silk hats with cold, calculating eyes. One man, a port official with a crooked smile, stepped forward. Don't worry, mademoiselle, he whispered, his voice like dry parchment. We will handle everything. Just give me your papers for safekeeping. Eleanor, dazed by the sudden death of her only friend, handed over the mahogany box, the box that held her freedom, the box that held her identity. She watched as the official walked into the fog. She didn't know it then, but she would never see those papers again. By the time the sun set over the Mississippi, Eleanor Reynolds, the heiress from Havana, had ceased to exist. In the eyes of the law, she was no longer a person. She was unclaimed property. As the heavy bolt of her cell slid into place, Eleanor realized the impossible secret was already beginning to work against her. She was too beautiful to be ignored, and too wealthy to be allowed to stay free. The nightmare had only just begun. They say New Orleans is a city built on water, but in the winter of 1837, it felt like it was built on bone. Eleanor Reynolds did not sleep. How could she? She was confined in a space the locals called a depository, a polite word for a human warehouse. The walls were cold limestone, sweating with the humidity of the swamp. There were no silk sheets here, no mahogany furniture, only the smell of damp straw, and the suffocating realization that the world she knew had vanished as the first light of dawn filtered through the iron-barred transom. The door creaked open. It wasn't the port official who had taken her box. It was a man named Silas Vance, a commission merchant in this city. That was a title for men who traded in souls. He didn't look like a monster. He wore a clean white linen suit and smelled of expensive tobacco. He looked at Eleanor not with cruelty, but with something far worse, appraisal. "Where are my papers?" Eleanor's voice was steady, despite the trembling in her heart. "Where is the man who took my box?" Vance smiled, a slow, thin line that didn't reach his eyes. "Papers, mademoiselle." There were no papers. "The gentleman you traveled with, the one who died, he brought no documents for you. He brought only a manifest." He held up a sheet of paper. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes scanning the ink. Her breath hitched. Her name was there, but beneath it, the word free had been scratched out. In its place, in fresh dark ink, was a single word, lean. In that moment, Eleanor understood the depth of the shadow. Her protector hadn't just died of a sudden illness. He had been removed, and her freedom hadn't been lost. It had been stolen by the very people sworn to protect the law. "You are a Villiard," Vance whispered, leaning closer. "You have the eyes of your father. But in this city, a Villiard with your complexion is either a queen or a commodity. And since you have no papers to prove you are a queen, the state has decided you are a commodity." Eleanor stood up, her silhouette tall against the damp stone wall. "My father was Jean-Baptiste Villard. He married my mother legally in Havana. There are records. There are witnesses." Vance chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Havana is a long way across the water, Eleanor. And in New Orleans, witnesses can be bought for the price of a bottle of bourbon. Your father's brothers, your uncles, they have spent the last 10 years waiting for him so they could claim his shipping empire. They aren't about to let a pearl from Cuba take the throne." This was the impossible secret. Eleanor wasn't just a victim of a slave, trader's greed. She was the victim of a family conspiracy. To her uncles, she wasn't a niece. She was a threat. If she remained free, she owned the ships. She owned the warehouses. She owned the very ground Silas Vance stood on. But if she was a slave, if she was property, then she owned nothing, not even her own name. As Vance turned to leave, he paused at the door. "Tonight, you will be moved to the St. Louis Hotel, not as a guest, but as the main event. Dress well, Eleanor. The men of this city have heard of the impossible heiress. They're coming to see if the legend is true." Eleanor was left in the dark. She reached into the lining of her silk sleeve, feeling the one thing they hadn't found, a small silver signet ring with her father's crest. She wasn't going to New Orleans to be sold. She was going to war. There is a specific kind of cruelty that dresses itself in velvet. Eleanor was moved under the cover of darkness. They didn't drag her through the mud. They carried her in a closed carriage, tucked away like a stolen diamond. When the doors opened, she wasn't in a dungeon anymore. She was in the crimson room of a private townhouse on Chartres Street. The walls were draped in heavy red damask. The air was thick with the scent of expensive rosewater and the cloying sweetness of French brandy. On the bed lay a gown of cream-colored lace, a dress fit for a debutante's ball. But Eleanor knew better. This wasn't a dressing room. It was a showroom. A woman entered. They called her Madame Dulac. She was a woman who had made a fortune polishing gems for the auction block. She looked at Eleanor not with sympathy, but with the cold, professional eye of a jeweler. "You are a rare find, petite," Dulac whispered, her voice like the hiss of a snake in silk. "The city is whispering about the Spanish queen who arrived with no past. Do you know what they are calling you? They call you the impossible secret." Eleanor didn't look at the dress. She looked at the woman. "I'm not a secret. I am Eleanor Villard, and every moment you keep me here is a crime that the Spanish crown will not overlook." Dulac laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "The Spanish crown? My dear, the ocean is wide, and the law in New Orleans is written by the men who have already decided your fate. Your father is dead. Your papers are ash tonight. You are simply the most expensive piece of art in Louisiana." For 3 days, Eleanor was kept in that room. She was fed the finest delicacies, bathed in scented oils, and forced to endure the presence of tailors who measured her as if she were a statue. It was a psychological war. They wanted her to forget the taste of freedom. They wanted her to accept that her beauty was now a cage. But late on the 3rd night, the door didn't open for Madame Dulac. It opened for a man Eleanor had never seen. He was tall, dressed in a black frock coat that seemed to swallow the light. His face was a mask of aristocratic boredom, but his eyes were sharp, cold, and possessed a terrifying intelligence. This was Charles Delacroix. He didn't speak at first. He simply walked to the table where Eleanor sat, picked up a crystal glass of wine, and turned it in the light. "They say you speak the language of the courts," Delacroix said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in the small room. "They say you know things that could burn this city to the ground." Eleanor met his gaze. "I know who I am, and I know who you are, monsieur. You are the man who buys what he cannot earn." Delacroix leaned in, his shadow stretching across the red walls. "I am the man who buys what must be hidden. The villain name is a ghost, Eleanor, and ghosts belong in the shadows. Tomorrow, I will pay a king's ransom for you, not because I want your beauty, but because I cannot afford for anyone else to hear your story." As he left, he dropped a single gold coin on the table. "Enjoy the wine, Eleanor. Tomorrow, you become a legend, and legends never get to speak for themselves." The St. Louis Hotel, in 1851, it was the jewel of New Orleans, a place of grand balls, political whispers, and the most famous slave rotunda in the world. Beneath its massive dome, the air was cold, despite the hundreds of bodies pressed together. Men in silk top hats and women in French lace gathered as if for the opera. But they weren't there for music. They were there to witness history. They were there to see the Spanish pearl finally sold. Eleanor stood behind a heavy velvet curtain. She could hear them, the laughter, the clinking of coins, the smell of expensive cigars mixing with the damp scent of the Mississippi River just outside the doors. She looked down at her hands. She was wearing the cream-colored lace gown. On her finger, hidden beneath a silk glove, was her father's signet ring, the only piece of her true self she had left. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer's voice boomed, echoing off the marble walls, "we come now to the lot you have all been waiting for. She is unique. She is educated. She is the impossible secret." The curtain pulled back. The light hit Eleanor, and for a moment, the room forgot to breathe. She didn't look like a slave. She stood with her head high, her eyes fixed on the back of the room, looking through the men as if they were ghosts. The bidding didn't start with a murmur. It started with a roar. $5,000. $7,000. $10,000. The numbers climbed past the price of the finest plantations, past the price of entire shipping fleets. The crowd began to murmur in shock. This wasn't a bidding war. It was a slaughter. In the corner of the room, her uncles watched from the shadows, their faces pale. They needed her gone. They needed her owned by someone who would keep her buried. Then a voice cut through the chaos like a blade of ice. $50,000. The room turned. Standing by the marble pillars was Charles Delacroix. He hadn't moved. He hadn't even taken his hands out of his pockets. $50,000. In 1851, it was an impossible, staggering fortune. It was enough to buy a kingdom. The auctioneer's hand trembled. 50,000! Going once. Eleanor locked eyes with Delacroix. In that gaze, there was no love, no desire, only the cold, odd recognition of a jailer looking at his most dangerous prisoner. "Sold!" The crowd erupted into a frenzy of whispers, but as the guards moved to lead Eleanor away, she did something no one expected. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked straight to the edge of the platform, leaned down, and looked directly at the man who had just bought her. "You spent a fortune to buy my silence, Monsieur Delacroix," she whispered, her voice carrying in the sudden hush. "But you forgot one thing. You can buy the bird, but you can never buy the song. And my father's truth is already written in places you cannot reach." Delacroix's smile faded. For the first time, a flicker of fear crossed his eyes. He had bought her for $50,000 to keep the Villard inheritance safe. But as he led her out into the New Orleans rain, he realized he hadn't just bought a woman. He had bought a revolution. The city of New Orleans left a trail of light on the horizon. But the carriage was heading into the dark. They traveled for 2 days, moving deeper into the heart of the Atchafalaya Basin, a world made of water, cypress trees, and Spanish moss that hung from the branches like gray skeletal hair. This was the Delacroix estate, a place where the law of the city didn't apply, a place where screams were swallowed by the swamp. When the house finally appeared through the fog, it didn't look like a plantation. It looked like a tomb. a massive white-pillared mansion rising out of the mud. Surrounded by a black water moat, Eleanor was led inside. There were no shackles on her wrists. Delacroix was too clever for that. He knew that physical chains could be broken, but psychological ones, they could last a lifetime. "This is your world now, Eleanor," Delacroix said, standing by the fireplace in a library filled with leather-bound books. "The servants have been told you are my ward. A distant relative with a fragile mind. You will eat the finest food. You will wear the finest silk. But you will never step beyond the iron gates. And you will never, under any circumstance, speak the name Villard." Eleanor walked to the window, watching the moss sway in the wind. "You think isolation will make me forget who I am? You think silence is the same as ignorance?" Delacroix poured a glass of amber liquid. "I think time is a very efficient eraser. In 6 months, the city will forget the impossible secret. In a year, the lawyers will have finished transferring your father's land into my name. And by then, Eleanor Villard will be a ghost that never existed." For weeks, the silence of the estate was Eleanor's only companion. Delacroix watched her like a hawk, dining with her every night, testing her, trying to find a crack in her resolve. He wanted her to beg. He wanted her to trade her secret for her freedom. But he underestimated the pearl. Late one night, while Delacroix was away on business in the city, Eleanor found her way into the restricted wing of the library. She wasn't looking for gold. She was looking for the one thing Delacroix feared more than death: proof. She found a loose floorboard beneath a heavy oak desk. Hidden inside wasn't a diary, but a ledger belonging to her father. As she flipped through the pages by the light of a single candle, her breath caught. It wasn't just a record of business. It was a map of a secret vault in the New Orleans Bank of Louisiana. A vault that could only be opened by the person wearing the Villard signet ring. Delacroix didn't just want her silence. He was desperate. He had the land, but he couldn't touch the liquid fortune, the millions in gold and silver. Without her, he needed her alive, and he needed her compliant. He hadn't bought a slave. He had bought a key, and he didn't realize that the key was already turning in the lock. Eleanor looked at the signet ring hidden in her palm. The impossible secret was no longer a burden. It was a weapon. "The vault is waiting, Monsieur Delacroix," she whispered into the darkness. "But it isn't waiting for you. Knowledge is a heavy thing. But for Eleanor, it was the only thing keeping her head above the rising tide of the swamp. In the dead of night, the Delacroix mansion felt less like a home and more like a living creature. Breathing through the drafts in the hallways, Eleanor sat on the floor of the library. The stolen ledger opened before her. The flickering candlelight danced off the pages, revealing the true scale of the impossible secret. It wasn't just about land or ships. Her father, Jean-Baptiste Villard, had seen the storm coming. He knew that in a world of greed, a daughter of mixed blood would be hunted. He hadn't just left her a fortune. He had left her a failsafe. The ledger detailed a series of deposits made in the Caribbean and New Orleans, wealth that was legally invisible to the Louisiana courts. But the most shocking entry was a date, October 14th, 1851. That was the day of the auction. The day Delacroix bought her. Eleanor realized then that the money Delacroix used to buy her hadn't been his own. He had leveraged the very Villard assets he was trying to steal. He was using her father's ghost to buy her father's daughter. It was a cycle of betrayal that turned Eleanor's blood to ice. Eleanor froze. She blew out the candle, the smell of burnt wax filling the dark room. The door swung open. A sliver of moonlight fell across the room, revealing the silhouette of Charles Delacroix. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the shadows. He didn't see her tucked behind the heavy velvet curtains, but he could smell the smoke. "I know you're awake, Eleanor," he said, his voice a smooth, terrifying purr. "You have a restless spirit. It's a trait of the Villards. They never knew when to surrender." He walked to the desk, his hand resting on the very spot where the floorboard was loose. Eleanor held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The city is buzzing," Delacroix continued, talking to the darkness. "They call you the Silent Pearl now. They wonder why I keep you hidden. They think I'm protecting your beauty. They don't realize I'm protecting my life. Because if you ever reach a courtroom, if you ever show them that ring, my world ends." He turned and left, the click of his cane fading down the hall. Eleanor emerged from the shadows, her eyes burning. She realized then that Delacroix wasn't just her master. He was her prisoner. He was tied to her by fear. He couldn't kill her because he needed her signature for the vault. And he couldn't free her because she knew too much. She reached into the floorboard and pulled out a single, thin piece of parchment she hadn't noticed before. It was a letter, never sent, addressed to a man named Marcus Valerius, a former slave who had become one of the most successful lawyers in the North. Her father's last words were written at the bottom: "When the lions circle, find the man who has already escaped the den." Eleanor didn't just have the secret anymore. She had a name. She had a destination. And for the first time since she stepped off that ship, she had a way out. While Eleanor sat in the silence of the swamp, the wolves were gathering in the city, in a private back room of the Orleans Club, hidden behind doors of reinforced mahogany. 3 men sat enveloped in a cloud of expensive cigar smoke. These were the men who truly ran Louisiana: a judge with a stained conscience, a senator with a silver tongue, and Eleanor's own uncle, Julien Villard. Julien leaned forward, the firelight catching the tremor in his hands. "Delacroix is taking too long," he hissed. "The girl has been at the estate for months. The banks are asking questions. The Spanish consulate is sniffing around the docks. If we don't get her signature on the transfer of the shipping fleet soon, the whole house of cards collapses." The judge, a man whose face looked like crumpled parchment, took a slow sip of brandy. "Delacroix paid $50,000 for her, Julien. He's not just a jailer. He's an investor. He wants to make sure that when she signs, she doesn't just sign away the land. He wants her to sign away her life." This was the impossible secret from the perspective of the predators. To them, Eleanor wasn't a human being. She was a legal glitch, a mistake in the system that needed to be corrected. They had spent years siphoning off the Villard fortune, thinking Jean-Baptiste would die childless in Cuba. When Eleanor appeared on that dock with her beauty and her papers, she wasn't a niece coming home. She was a witness to their grand theft. "She has the ring," Julien whispered, his voice cracking. "My brother told me on his deathbed, the vault in the Bank of Louisiana only opens for the crest. Without it, we are just men sitting on a mountain of paper. We need that gold to pay off the debts of the last harvest." The senator, who had been quiet until now, looked up. His eyes were like 2 pieces of flint. "Then stop waiting for Delacroix's psychology to work. If she won't sign for silk and wine, she will sign for blood." He tapped a rhythm on the table. "Send word to the Bayou. Tell Delacroix he has 1 week. If the pearl hasn't surrendered the secret by the next full moon, the estate is to be burned to the ground. Accidental fires happen in the swamp all the time. And ghosts, well, ghosts don't hold shipping titles." Julien Villard looked into his glass. He saw the reflection of his own greed, and for a second he saw the face of his brother's daughter. But he didn't flinch. The cabal of wolves had made their decision. The time for games was over. The hunt was moving from the shadows into the light. The clock was ticking, and 20 miles away, in a house surrounded by black water, Eleanor Reynolds felt the air grow cold. She didn't know about the meeting in the city, but she knew the wolves were no longer content to wait at the gate. In the kingdom of the blind, the one who sees is a king. But in the kingdom of the enslaved, the one who can read is a revolutionary. Eleanor knew her time was running out. She had seen the messengers arriving at the estate. Men on lathered horses, carrying letters sealed with the dark wax of the city's elite. The air around Delacroix had changed. He no longer looked at her with boredom. He looked at her with the desperation of a drowning man. She needed to reach the world outside the swamp. But how? The gates were guarded, and the bayou was a maze of alligator-infested water. Then she saw him. He was a young boy, no older than 12. Named Toby, he was the one who brought the wood for her, fire and the water for her bath. He moved like a shadow, silent and invisible, as most servants were to men like Delacroix. But Eleanor saw the light in his eyes, a hunger for something more than the dirt beneath his fingernails. "And Toby," she whispered one evening as he knelt by the hearth, "do you know what this is?" She held up a book. The boy shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. To be caught with a book was a death sentence in the parish. "These are voices," Eleanor said, her voice a low melody. "Voices of men who died 100 years ago, still speaking to us. If you help me, I will give you your own voice for 2 weeks." Under the very nose of Charles Delacroix, a secret education took place. While the master of the house sat downstairs drinking his port and plotting her ruin, Eleanor sat on the floor of her room, teaching Toby the alphabet by tracing letters in the soot of the fireplace. She wasn't just teaching him to read. She was preparing a messenger. On the night the moon turned full, the deadline set by the Cabal, Eleanor handed Toby a small, wax-sealed packet. It contained the location of the vault, a copy of the ledger's map, and a letter addressed to the lawyer, Marcus Valerius. "You must take the small skiff," she told him, her hands gripping his shoulders. "Follow the North Star until you hit the river. Find the man with the silver cane in New Orleans. Do not stop. Do not speak to anyone. If they catch you, tell them you stole it. Do not mention the pearl." Toby looked at the packet, then at the woman who had treated him like a human being for the first time in his life. He didn't say a word. He simply tucked the secret into his tunic and vanished into the fog of the swamp. Eleanor stood at her window, watching the black water. She had just gambled her life, her fortune, and the life of a child on a single hope. Downstairs, she heard the heavy thud of Delacroix's boots. He was coming for her. The week was up. The wolves were at the door. But as the handle of her bedroom door began to turn, Eleanor didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a fuse. And the fire had just been lit. New Orleans, June 1851. The heat in the courtroom was suffocating, thick with the scent of sweat and expensive cologne. But the temperature wasn't what kept the city's elite on the edge of their seats. It was the woman sitting in the defendant's chair. Eleanor Reynolds, the impossible Pearl, had done what no one thought possible. She hadn't just escaped the swamp. She had walked into the heart of the law and demanded it answer for its crimes. Across the room sat the Cabal, Julien Villard, Charles Delacroix, and the lawyers who had built their careers on the bones of the voiceless. They looked at Eleanor with a mixture of contempt and terror. To them, she was property, but to the crowd outside, she was a symbol of a world that was about to break. The silence was broken by the sound of a silver cane striking the floorboards. Marcus Valerius, the man Toby had found in the shadows of the docks, stepped forward. He was a man who moved like a king in a room full of beggars. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the jury. "Gentlemen," Valerius began, his voice like rolling thunder, "this case is not about a woman's beauty. It is not even about her blood. It is about a theft so grand, it makes the pirates of the Gulf look like amateurs. You see a slave? I see the rightful owner of the very chairs you are sitting in." The prosecution erupted in shouts. "She has no papers. She is a runaway, a fugitive from the Delacroix estate." Valerius waited for the noise to die down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silk-wrapped object. He didn't show it to the judge. He walked straight to Eleanor and asked her to hold out her hand. "They say you have no proof, mademoiselle," Valerius whispered, loud enough for the back row to hear. "Show them the ghost of Jean-Baptiste Villard." Eleanor stood up. She removed her glove, revealing the silver signet ring, but she didn't just show it. She pressed it into a block of red sealing wax on the evidence table. "The Bank of Louisiana has a vault," Valerius shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "A vault that has been locked since the day Jean-Baptiste died. There is only one key in the world that can open it. Not a metal key, but a crest. If this woman is a slave, then that vault will stay shut forever. But if she is the daughter, the gold of the Villard Empire will answer her call." The courtroom was so silent, you could hear the heartbeat of the man next to you. The judge, sweating under his wig, looked at the seal. It was an exact match for the Villard family crest. A crest Julien Villard had tried to forge for a decade. Delacroix stood up, his face pale, his eyes darting to the exit. He knew. The impossible secret was no longer a whisper in a red room. It was a roar in the halls of justice. The conspiracy was crumbling. The wolves were starting to turn on each other. But as the jury looked from the ring to the woman who wore it, they realized they weren't just judging a girl. They were judging the soul of New Orleans. They say the truth is like a river. You can dam it, you can divert it, but eventually it will find its way to the sea. The jury was out for 3 days. 3 days where the city of New Orleans held its breath. The markets stopped. The ships stayed at anchor. In the coffee houses of the French Quarter, men whispered that if Eleanor Villar won, the world as they knew it would end. They were right. When the door finally opened and the foreman stepped forward, the air in the courtroom felt electric. Charles Delacroix was not there to hear the verdict. He had vanished into the swamp the night before, chased by the shadows of his own greed. Julien Villard sat alone, his head in his hands, a broken king in a paper crown. We find, the foreman's voice cracked the silence, that the defendant is not property. We find that the documents provided by Marcus Valerius are genuine. And we find that Eleanor Villard is the sole heir to the Villard estate. It was the first time in the history of the South that a secret had fought back and won. But Eleanor didn't stay to celebrate. She didn't want the ships, or the warehouses, or the blood-stained land. The day after the vault was opened, revealing a fortune that made the city's debt look like pocket change, Eleanor did something the cabal never predicted. She liquidated it all. Every ship was sold. Every warehouse was emptied. And the money? It didn't go into her pocket. It flowed like a healing tide into the schools, the churches, and the secret networks that helped others find the path to freedom she had walked. Eleanor Villard disappeared from New Orleans that autumn. Some say she returned to Havana. Others say she moved north to join Valerius in the fight that would eventually lead to the Civil War. But if you walk the streets of the French Quarter today, near the old St. Louis Hotel, you might still feel her presence. The impossible pearl became a ghost story, a legend told by those who have nothing, to remind them that even the most powerful men have a weakness, that the truth is the only thing you cannot buy. Charles Delacroix was found months later, deep in the Atchafalaya Basin. He hadn't been killed by the swamp. He'd simply lost his mind, wandering the black water, looking for a woman who was never truly his to hold. History is written by the winners, but the truth belongs to the brave. In 1851, a woman was sold for $50,000, but she walked away, owning the world. This was the impossible secret of New Orleans.